All right, so I am just going to show you at some point, Mark is going to show you a couple of kind of sample or template forms as he goes through the presentation. So I am going to show you how to find them and how to pull them down. We'll be sharing them on screen, but you may want to go ahead and pull them down as well so that you have them and you can kind of follow along. So let me share my screen. Okay, so the hub that you were invited to, where you are accessing all of the workshops for the financial conference, probably when you log on, the home screen looks something like this. Either from this screen or from the schedule screen, if you select, you click on the title for this, which again is documenting conflict of interest and cost allocation. If you click on the title for it, then get a screen that looks like this. And up here in the right corner is a resources tab. So if you click on that, you'll see 5 documents. This last one, the one that's a PDF, is the PowerPoint. So you also have that so that you don't feel like you have to fast and furious take notes. You will have access to that. These other 4 documents are the ones that Mark are going to walk us through at some point. So if you just click on this little download icon, a little arrow down, then it will download the documents. And then if you're in your whatever browser you're using, Chrome or Firefox or whatever, they usually they have this little download icon up here towards the right. If you click on that, whoops, then the document that you just downloaded will be there and you can click on it to open it. So I would suggest if y'all would take just a minute and go ahead and download all 4 of those documents. So there's a conflict of interest TASA form, a sample detailed CAP or cost allocation plan, training sample, and then conflict of interest policy sample. So again, if you could take a few minutes and just go ahead and download those, it'll probably make it easier for you to kind of follow along with the presentation when we get to that part. And again, I am going to be showing it, so if you have problems for some reason, you can follow along. We'll share it on screen and then just reach out to us after the presentation and we'll figure out how to get you access to those. And that is it for me. I'll turn it over to Mark.
Okay, as we start our share screen. Okay, can you see the slide? First of all, to make sure.
Mark, we see it in presentation view.
Oh, okay. You see it in presentation view, but not the.
Yes.
So you see the 2 slides or just one?
Yes,
Just
we see it too.
Okay. We'll go back. Do it this way.
There, it looks good.
This first. Okay, so you can still see just one slide. Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. We're doing 2 sections this time, 2 topics. I think they're both pretty relevant at this time. The first one we're going to do is we're going to start with conflict of interest. As we talk about it and discuss it, I'll have 2 templates that I'll show you, and one is a detailed one, and then one that I've drafted that's a simplified version of that. And you can use either one template if you'd like for your organization. And then after that section, then we'll be talking about cost allocation plan. Now, we've done cost allocation plans before, where we talk deeply into how to do the cost allocation plan. In this section, what we're doing is how to write the cost allocation plan. So what you're doing is documenting that part. And as we go through those processes, we will then have another slide that will have two more versions or templates that you could use. And as you download it, then you can keep it there. All of them are in Word as a Word document. So that way you can, as you download it, you can save it and then decide which form you'd like to use and then tailor to your own organization. So our acronyms are pretty much the same as yesterday's. We have the 2 CFR, so the Code of Federal Regulations. You'll see a lot of people call them that, the Uniform Grant Guidance. They just shortcut it instead of the 2 CFR Part 200, and then the long name for all of the kind of parts 2 grants in that sense. A lot of them shorten it to just the Uniform Grant Guidance. And then we have HHSC, the OOG, and the OAG that could be involved in this process at the same time. So that's our acronyms. For our agenda, like I talked about, we'll start with the conflict of interest. And within the conflict of interest, there's also the general procurement standards. And those two tie together for the conflict of interest. And then as we talk about our cost allocation plan, we'll be talking about the direct cost and shared cost and how do you document that. Now, I've pulled up the definition of conflict of interest from the 2 CFR. And as you can see, when it says 200.112, when you get into the 100 series, that's the definition series. That's where you can find all the definitions for whatever part of the grant that you're looking for. Conflict of interest has now become a lot stronger in the sense of grant funders looking at that in that situation. Part of it is like what Roger talked about in the audit area of his presentation, that internal control has become a higher valued area than it used to be in the old circulars. And within internal controls, part of the way to document your internal controls is conflict of interest. That kind of pulls together. The other part is with this kind of new scrutiny on grants from the administration. This part, it's good to have so that you're kind of covering yourself at the same time, that you do have a conflict of interest document that you use. I think it's very helpful. In most cases, I'd say 90% of all of our organizations don't have an issue with conflict of interest. There may be at the most 10%, but at the same time, it's good for all of us to at least identify what it is and then using a form so that you can protect yourself about whether you have a conflict of interest or not. Now, as it goes with the conflict of interest definition, the must is that the federal agencies must establish a conflict of interest that they will pass through to either the recipients or their pass-through entities. And that requirement goes in that direction. And when you talk about that, then you talk about recipients, like we talked about yesterday, are ones that get a direct award from the federal agency, where subrecipients get their awards from a pass-through entity. But in either case, whether you're a recipient or a subrecipient, you will need to disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest. That's just how the the regulations they flow from the federal agency to the pass-through entity to either recipient or subrecipient. So I've put that up there and it's in quotes, so you don't have to keep going back to 500 pages of the 2 CFR to find these kind of information. You've got it right here, and that is the direct quote from it. Now, how does that conflict of interest work within that? The biggest part of where a conflict of interest would be in the procurement area that we have. And with that, that standard, I've put up the area that's specific to conflict of interest when you talk about procurement standards. Procurement standards start, I think, at 316 or somewhere around there, all the way to 320s numbers and all that. So there's a lot of different things in procurement. But here under C of the 318, that's where you'll find the conflict of interest in there. And again, it's basically states that you must maintain a written standard for covering your conflict of interest. Now, when we get to conflict of interest, as it works over here, you're talking about anyone that's in the organization or that has some due influence on the organization. So when we talk about due influence, and that could be a board member, it could be your officer or registered agent for that nonprofit if you're a nonprofit. Anyone that has some control on the organization would also be considered for the conflict of interest. And we will kind of work through that process. Again, I say that probably 90% do not have a conflict of interest. In my years with grants, the 10% may have a conflict of interest, but if you do what we're talking about, you will kind of cure that process. Excuse me. So you can have a conflict of interest. You can cure it by documentation. And the biggest part of curing that conflict of interest is that if you're voting, if that person that has a conflict is voting on an award, let's say for contracts or anything that your organization is liable for, then they should put in writing what the conflict is, and then they should not be part of the award process. So they shouldn't be voting on it, on those part. If you do those two things in that area, if they're not voting on it, then yes, you've documented the conflict of interest, but you've kind of cured it by not allowing that person to vote. And especially in small areas, that may be the only vendor that you have, and they still may be awarded. It's okay if it's awarded as long as you've done your due diligence with your conflict of interest. So to identify a conflict of interest, it'd be anybody, like I talked about, that's involved in the organization externally or internally, and their family members or their partners. And in that kind of situation, when we're talking about that, let's say a board member is either by that person or their person's family members owning a particular deliverable that you need, like if you need rent and that's the only place you can get the facility, then that needs to be identified. And we're talking about not just the board member, but any person within that board member's immediate family or their partner. Let's say they're a partner in the rent or anything else, then they would need to disclose that too at the same time. The main thing about conflict of interest is that what you want to do is that you want to cure anything of any personal tangible benefits that that particular person could get from the organization. That could be anything from, let's say, that person owns a supply store or anything, and that's the only place you can get supplies. If you're doing it locally, you can still do that, but that person cannot vote on it. Now, typically, if it's supplies, you can always go into the internet and and order those kind of things. So that's one of the things that happens. As we talk about the process of conflict of interest, if the organization decides to use that vendor, even though there's a conflict, but the conflict has been removed by removing whoever is involved in that conflict, you can still have that vendor being used in your organization. What will happen a lot of times if it's significant, the auditor in the audited financial statements will put a footnote, which is called a related party transaction. Related party transactions are exactly what they say, that your organization is having a transaction with a related party. That related party, again, could be a board member, could be an employee that their spouse or anybody else is the vendor in those kind of situations. So you're kind of working through that part. And if it gets to the point where you do have the award, then the other cure is that the auditor, and you should state that, yes, we have all this stuff. And oh, by the way, just notifying the reader of the financial statement that there is a related party transaction that's identified in the footnote. It identifies it of what it is, what is the related party transaction, and all the documentation that goes to it in the sense of a format. That's how we kind of get to the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest also could be some other little things that come about. Let's say that an employee receives a gift. Now, gifts usually under $25 is considered insignificant in that situation, and you wouldn't need to do a conflict of interest. But let's say you have an employee, and that employee gets, let's say, season tickets to a sporting event, and that employee also happens to be one of the ones that picks the vendors and approves of vendors. That would definitely be a strong conflict of interest in that situation. So you're always looking at what can that person have as a personal gain? How does that influence them on how they go ahead and be in the process of awarding those kind of contracts? Do we have any questions before we get on to the next part? I'll be talking about the different templates that we have. Thought that'd be a good stopping point.
Mark, we don't have any questions in the chat, but just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, definitely can put them in the chat.
Okay, so since we're going to look at the the forms, I will need to get out of this. Where's my shared section? There it is. So I'll stop share. And Tim will bring up the two documents. We'll talk about the first one, which this is the it's a simplified version of the conflict of interest. It has all the elements of the conflict of interest that I think HHSC had a real detailed form. So here we've taken all of those things that are in detailed and compressing it down into kind of more the relevant part. So when you look at that, each person that could have a potential conflict of interest should fill this out. Even the ones that don't, in the sense like the board members, they should fill it out, and they would be either no conflict of interest that backs you up, that you've got a supporting documentation to it, or that if you do, then you detail what the conflict could be. And it could be a couple of conflicts that are in there. So you would just put it in there each time of what that board member or whoever that might have vote on something that benefits them. So as you can look up the first part of that, the bullets that will explain to you, that any financial interest, any tangible personal benefits in that process, conflicts include as we talked about, board members, employees, family members, extended family members, things like that. Those are the detailed parts of it. And then, about any kind of gifts or anything or gratuities that is greater than the $25, then you would need to do something about that. So that kind of provides you those kind of guidelines. I think it's a shorter version, but it gives you all the elements to that. And then naturally that person would identify it and then sign it at the end. Can we move down to the signature part? So in that area, then you would have the person print their name, the signature, title, if there's anything like a board member or president of the board, or if it's an employee, then the employee's name and on there, and they're with their title, and then the date that you sign it. This is a simplified version. Can we go to the detailed version? And the detailed version comes from HHSC. They have some good guidance out there, but like any agency, like what I was in, you like to have more is better, because if you're giving it out to 100 or more grantees, you want to try to be as broad as possible. So in that case, they do it in the sense of a detailed part. And what we have here, you have kind of sections, which are kind of what I've done is kind of just simplified that into these areas. So you've got the section for the purpose. Why do you have this conflict of interest form? You have then in the section of the person of concerns that would be in there. And then the areas of conflict would be number 3 that you would have in there. And it's very detailed, as you can see how they do that. And then the last part of that would be the nature of the conflict, where you kind of explain the kind of, you've already shown the part of the conflict, but explaining the nature of it will get you that understanding. This, I think, is a very good training tool. I think it's very good as a kind of document to explain, or you could use this all the way with the signatures and everything as we go. And then we have the section that the interpretation of the statement policy that's in there, which references both section 3 and 4 as you work through that. And then finally you get to section 6, which is the disclosure policy, which is written out and detailed in that situation. And then you finally get to the last part of it, which would be going to the form itself. And here's the conflict of interest form that they have. And you can see right here, similar to what we had on the simplified version, then you have the name of the person, the capacity. So it could be, typically it's board in that situation, could be somebody that's outside or a staff position or staff name. You would just pick the ones which are, and then you go through each of the detail that they have, like what's the affiliation. If there's none, you don't have to write anything. If it's yes, then you write the information that you do in that situation. Same thing for number 4, is it's a yes or no answer. And then if it's a yes, then you describe the nature of that. And you just keep going down the things of 5 and 6 of those kind of natures that happen in that sense. So they make it very detailed, and you just go through the process and say yes or no. Hopefully, most cases it's no on those things. But if you do have a yes, then you've got the documentation of why and everything. And then finally at the end, then they have a block for signature and the date in that situation. So this is more of a detailed version. I think it's a great training tool. I like kind of yes, less is best in that kind of situation. You could just use their form if you want for the form itself. So if you go back up to 1 on this thing, you could use that, or you could use the simplified version that you don't have to answer each one of these questions and do that. So you could go in either direction depending on how your organization wants to detail it, but that's a good part. I would keep something like this for training, so that if people have questions about what is conflict of interest and how does that deal with our organization, you've got a more robust look at it. But if you're just documenting, I think it's better to try to have all the elements, but not get in so much detail, because as an auditor, whatever you give us as an auditor, we will go through it and we'll review it. And I caution that when you do a lot of this and you have 6 or 7 different elements to it, and you missed one, or that it was supposed to be yes instead of no, you're opening up yourself to a little bit more questions and potential findings in that situation. So that's the rationale that I have for doing more simplified. It does have all the elements in it, so it's not that you're missing anything. It's just it kind of closes that door for an auditor to ask questions. So those are the 2 documents for conflict of interest I wanted to show y'all. And again, it's in Word, so you could take this as a template and then adapt it to whatever your organizational needs are. Okay, so Tim, we can stop share that. I'll come back. Do we have any questions on conflict of interest? Because we're right at that point. And
I have a question for you, Mark.
Yes.
Just so in an event where you do have like the example you gave of somebody, owns a business that sells office supplies, and they're married to somebody who is, let's say, the director or the finance, or somebody who would have influence
Anybody.
decision making.
Mm.
Is there a step beyond like just having that person not involved in that decision making? Like, does there need to be like, hey, we looked at these other office supply companies and the prices are either comparable or cheaper? Like,
Yeah.
is that more than
When you have
a
conflict of interest, it would be better to then do more documentation of things that we would you would get into, so that you're kind of defending your method of award in that sense, even if it's that you don't go with that vendor that could be a conflict. I think it's always better to have more documentation so that you can get into protecting the organization. Now, one of the things, the reason I kind of talk about that way, I have seen areas where there's been a conflict of interest that could significantly impact the organization. One example, and this was way back, probably a decade, 2 decades ago, but there was an organization that did things with children, and it was more kind of just daycare kind of stuff. But the president of the board owned the facility that they were using, and the conflict there was already a conflict of interest. But the issue that came up with the grants and everything else is that that particular board member voted and helped to get the contract for his property, and that the property that he was using for the facilities and everything was much higher than the area in that sense. So he was getting personal gain. It just so happened that was close to the 80s or into the 80s area where the economy was really at a dipped area because of the oil and gas situation and agriculture and everything else. So everything was suppressed at that time. but it just so happens that this person, was able to get his property, and there was not only one, but they had a couple of them that were that way, where he used other nonprofits to benefit and have his property. First of all, where a lot of them were not being used because of the economy. His was able to be rented out and everything. But then even more importantly, he was renting it way above the market value in a depressed economy. So that's kind of a sample of what could get you into problems in that situation. Another one, just quickly, an organization that had some property that had environmental dumping and everything else. In the environmental laws, that anybody that owns that property is now liable for cleanup and very expensive stuff. So they found a way to just say, okay, we're just going to donate it to a nonprofit. It relieves our liability of everything, which technically in the law it didn't, but in their minds they thought they did that. So that's why they gave this nonprofit a great deal of land. Well, it was spoiled land because it was the property could not be used because of the hazardous materials. Is that helpful for everybody? So now that we've identified conflict of interest, that's kind of the examples that you would have. Like I said, 90% or probably 95% of the programs and nonprofits don't truly have that kind of issue. You don't have a board member that's also could be a landlord or anything else like that. But it's always good to protect yourself. And most of all, you're documenting that you don't have anything there. And with the kind of the environment right now of of grants being really scrutinized and trying to find ways to defund organizations, we don't want to give people that opportunity to say, well, we're defunding this because of fraud, waste, and abuse in that situation. So now we can go to cost allocation plan. On cost allocation plan, we've had a couple of webinars on this, on how to do cost allocation, the methodologies, the calculations, everything else. But with, again, the scrutiny of grants right now, it's kind of now starting to get imperative that not only do you demonstrate that by your spreadsheets or any way that you do your cost allocation, it's good to cover yourself by doing a cost allocation plan, really a document that shows that. And how do you do that? You summarize in writing how you're going to allocate those costs and what kind of costs you're going to allocate. So in most cases, when you talk about cost allocation, it's either have a direct or shared costs. The reason I use more shared costs than indirect, that in cost allocation plans, if you look at the appendix, I think it's appendix 3 of the 2 CFR, details for nonprofits cost allocation plans. And within that part, they have a section for indirect cost rates or de minimis rates. So a lot of times it gets kind of blurry. So, and most indirect costs are shared cost in that situation. We'll talk about that. So when we're documenting the cost allocation, I kind of, again, have it a little bit more simplified so that auditors and other people don't go so detailed. You've made it so detailed that if you miss one part, you could be subject to a finding or other things. But what you want to do is just use the one that's called the simplified method in that cost allocation in within the section of 3, where those parts are detailed about cost allocation. And what most organizations use is kind of the simplified method. There's several different methods that we have talked about in the past. There's a simplified, there's one that's kind of more of a, which is kind of a combination of direct and shared costs. Then you have others that you basically break down into the indirect cost rates, and it could be a modified or it could be very detailed. And that gets, those cost rates have to be, if you're getting an indirect cost rate, you need to have that approved by the cognizant agency that the grant is in, and that takes time. And we work through that process. And then as you write your plan as a document, you identify the methods that you're using for shared cost. So here's how we could do that. First of all, what are direct costs? Direct costs are costs that you could actually directly identify to the activity of the grant. I usually say activity of the grant because, you know, you got your grant source, but in that grant source and your award, it's the specific activities that allow for you to get the award. So there could be things, and here's a couple of things. Most of the time, especially now, equipment would not be in the type of grants that we have with HHSC, with the governor's office or the OAG, or even with TASA as a pass-through, because equipment went from $5,000 to now $10,000. In most grants, you're not going to see that. You will every now and then see it in some kind of grant that's working on, let's say, they want to upgrade kind of the digital part or other things, like IT issues and all that, where you could have that might be, let's say, if you have a call center, or even replacing all your phones in your organization and with the server and everything else that you have, all of those dollars could lead up to, before October of last year, 2024, it would be $5,000. After October 1, it's now $10,000. So you could have a situation where you would have that cost to that level, but I would say the majority do not have that. Then you get down to direct costs of, let's say, a training, conference, webinars, seminars that are directly for a specific activity or a specific grant. So let's say the sexual assault, like with our conference, and you have a sexual assault grant, then you can allocate those direct costs of the training and other things like that. If it was a human trafficking and you have a human trafficking grant, you can directly cost those out to that area. So depending on what the expenditure is and what the activity is. So we're looking at specific activities that are direct in that situation. Along with that, you could have travel costs. So that the travel to, like, this conference, if you're going to it and you've been here for the in-person, that could be allocated to that particular grant that allows for that type of activity, because it's 100% in that kind of situation. Travel costs that might be specific to grant activity could be one where you're sharing, not sharing, but you're providing costs. Let's say, like, you give travel vouchers for your survivors to use for bus passes to go and get services outside of your organization, and it's specific to that kind of grant in that situation. If it's a family violence situation and it's actually specifically for that activity, that travel cost, you can take that cost directly. And then any specific client assistance costs, it would be the same way. So if you have costs for specifically for, let's say, counselors that you're sending your survivors to that are very specific to that grant activity, then that could be counted that way. Now, what typically happens is most of this stuff is kind of shared cost that you're allocated in that situation. One of the first things that is a big shared cost is personal compensation. Unless you have a person that's 100% funded by a specific grant, most of your other personnel are shared by different grants, and it's usually shared by an FTE allocation that somebody is funded, let's say 75% on a specific grant, like let's say family violence. And then you have that person still doing sexual assault activities and are funded by another grant that allows for sexual assault. That would be, a shared cost. A lot of our personnel are shared costs on multiple areas. Now, it could be multiple activities, or those activities are part of that grant. So you may have a person that's, let's say, on a VOCA grant that's also on an OAG grant, like a VADG grant, Victims Directed Assistance grants, or even with HHSC, you might have that kind of component. Well, that's a shared cost. And how do we go about that? Other things that are shared costs are travel costs. Again, a lot of those things. Local travel might be one of those areas of shared costs where you have an advocate that's going out and they're doing one stop, that they're doing something specific for that grant. And then they're also shared by another grant, and they also move over and they're doing another thing that's specific to a different grant. Then you would have that shared cost, and you would work out your cost allocation on those kind of shared costs. That's where you could see, shared cost in travel. Program services cost, again, would be the same way. You might have a counselor, but that counselor that you're sending might be for split services and split grants. Then you would use a shared cost in that situation. Professional services, again, which could be, again, the counselor or other things, legal services, might be another part of a shared cost allocation. Supplies are very big about, typically it's harder to parcel out supplies to specific grants. This would be an area where you get your shared cost involved. And then where you have grants that have other direct office expense, or ODOE as we call them, and everything, are kind of shared cost again. And I've got kind of examples of rent, insurance, utilities, communications, all those things that are in that you usually expend and you're charging, and your budget is in the other direct operating expense, could be there. Match is very kind of one of those things that is a shared cost, because you're taking the cost that you have on one grant, and for federal match or in-kind, it should be a state cost. So if you have one that's in a state, has state funds, you can use, let's say, personnel that's done with that and match it to a federal grant at the same time. And in that case, that's a shared cost you have for either cash or in-kind expense. So that's how we kind of divide that. And that's kind of the area you want to start figuring out how to document those things. So as we do that, there's different kind of cost allocation methodologies. The majority of people will use FTEs, full-time equivalents. First, most of the time, the full-time equivalents was used for personnel, figuring out where your personnel is going to be, their percentage of time going to whatever grant, and then attributing that cost to each specific grants that a person which would be one FTE could have percentages in different grants. That's where your full-time equivalents. The better part of that is that once you figured that out, it's much easier to use that FTE equivalents to then cost allocate your shared cost in that situation, because you've already got a basis of what a shared cost is by activities of the person that's providing those services to those particular grants. But you could break out some of that into square footage. Let's say it's easier, or you feel that it's more complete to take out rent, and you've got specific areas that you can better calculate shared costs by square footage. You could do that in that part. And then finally, with the cost allocation methods, you might have, and very few will have something like that, where you can take that direct unit cost. And when we talk about direct unit costs, it's unit costs. So typically what we'll see in, let's say, printing and other things like that, you may have where you can allocate by the type of printing and everything that those dollars would adhere to, and you can provide that. That is another cost allocation method. These are primarily the ones that we use, but I would say FTE is the where most organizations will use that. Okay, let's go ahead and I'll unshare, and we'll look at the examples of forms that we have for that. Okay.
Which one do you want to start with, Mark?
The detailed one, if we can. I'm trying to look. I think this might be, that's a simplified version. I could talk about that first, like I did the other one. Now, here's an example of kind of a detailed cost allocation plan. And this one started out with HHSC again. And when I looked at it, it was a very old form that was used in the old OMB circulars. And that's why I put 2 CFR in here and highlighted it, just to let people know that those were kind of the adaptations that I did, so that I can bring that up a little bit more into speed of what the true allocation should be by the new 2 CFR. So as we go through that process, you can see that as you're determining and you're explaining your allocation, and it should be by the standards. Well, what standards? The 2 CFRs right now. And then you go into your general approach and explaining what you're going to do there. And you could have one of the things is that, first of all, you want to allocate all kind of direct costs, but even more, you want to allocate all allowable costs. There are costs in there that maybe grants don't pay for, that are unallowable, which would be, let's say, fundraising in that situation. But you document those things. Then you document about all the allowable indirect costs. I like to put it as shared costs, because I don't want to confuse the auditor or other people that will say, well, what about your indirect costs? Are you talking about your indirect cost rate, or are you doing it as kind of in a direct method using shared costs to allocate that part? And then it details more about your program costs. And then they start with allocating the costs. How do you do that? Compensation, this is how they're doing it. Well, their compensation is made up of naturally your salary, but then also your benefits. And what are the fringe benefits? You're documenting what kind of fringe benefits, within fringe benefits, as they call it. You can have, vacation, holiday, sick leave. So other organizations just say PTO or break that up. Then you go down and you look at each one of those travel costs, identifying it, and writing it up. Professional service cost, and then office expense and supply costs. So it's documenting all of the different types of costs that you may have in here, equipment, like we look at that, facilities, insurance, telephone. So it really gets detailed. That's why I call it a detailed format. And it goes all the way down to your training, clients, assistance, in kind or a match in other sense. And then it also details about the allowable costs. And as again, you can see that I've highlighted that as 2 CFR. Now, this template is a real old template, and the examples that were given way back then, and could have been the standard that CPAs and maybe one or two funding agencies would allow. But I would not recommend using any of the examples that are below, because what they're doing is they're taking the cost and just using cost or revenue as their percentage of their total expenses by the different sections, administrative, fundraising, programs, usually the part for the grants. And that's how they do that. Most funders have gotten away from that a long time ago, and they want to see more, how do you what's your rationale for doing your cost allocation more, that's more defendable than just revenue or expenses, because that can kind of skew some of your costs. And as you go down, we'll just quickly go down to the other examples. It's the same thing. They're using the cost instead of more activities and other things to get to a cost allocation plan. So as you can see at the top of that, I would not recommend using any of these, because most of your funders, if you use something like this, they'll probably kick it back and ask you questions. So now we can go to the simplified version. As you can see from the detailed one, it actually writes down every single transaction type and everything. What we did over here is now we talked about it in the sense that, the purpose statement, that's your kind of your policy in one sense, would be that you're using cost principles to do this in that for your cost allocation. And as you go through your cost allocation, you're using 2 CFR 200 Part E, which is the cost principles. So you're documenting how you're getting to allocate your costs, where you're allocating it through reasonable costs and allowable costs that are in here, which is within the subpart E for determining cost and all that. And you're using that as a reference, so you don't have to go through every single transaction and explain how that's part of what you're using as your shared costs. And then we come back up over here and we start talking about, we detailed what will be in the components for anything that you're going to use cost allocating for direct cost in that situation. As in the slides before, these are the kind of the examples that could be direct costs. You've already put it out there for the auditor and anybody else that's reading that when you're using direct costs and not cost allocating all the way, it's because it's directly attributed to that grant and that activity, where the majority would then be in the next one where we're talking about, and why I put FTE in here, that's the primary cost allocation methodology that you use. So you go ahead and document, under this situation, we're going to use FTE method for our shared costs, and here are our shared costs that we have. So you bulleted out what could potentially be in your shared costs that you're going to allocate. And then down at the bottom, you have here, if you decided to change, let's say, rent or anything else like that, then you would document in addition that you're using square footage or direct cost units. In most cases for rent, it's square footage as your cost allocation, and it's documented in here so that when the auditor sees the calculations, you know that they're doing that. Another part that could be in here further, let's say if your organization uses the indirect cost rate, then you would document that and say that certain costs are attributed to your indirect cost rate, and which is approved by your cognizant agency. So you've already documented what you plan to do in that situation if you're going to use an indirect cost rate. If you're not going to truly use an indirect cost rate and decide to use the the de minimis rate, you may have all these costs that you're doing right now as your cost allocation plan, but oh, by the way, you're also using the de minimis rate. You should write that in there. I did not put those as examples. It would only be if your organization is truly doing that, then you should document it in a plan. And as you can see within this, we've taken 4 pages or more of all the different things and compress it down to here are the sections that we would use whatever methodology. And you can see it's about a page, but it has all the elements that you need. And if anybody has any questions, we could talk about the 2 documents, or we can go on back if you would like. I'll give a moment for any chat that.
I have a question, actually.
Okay.
So is it okay to use 2 different cost allocation methods with different budget categories?
Yes.
Okay.
You can do in your cost allocation, you can have multiple cost allocations. And the reason you would do that is you've isolated something and you decide it's more appropriate to use this methodology than the other. And that's how you would document it. So like I was talking about on square footage, that would be one that would deviate from the FTE method because you think that you can allocate the cost a little bit more correctly if you think about it in one sense, or you could use some other kind of methodology for another type of transaction that you're doing or budget line item. So what you're looking at with cost allocation plan is how do I defend my allocation? I'm using a plan to defend it and it's reasonable. And you've got your criteria in there so that if an auditor comes in, you've got your support to defend how you're doing cost allocation. And that helps, as I say, kind of connects the dots and everything so that when an auditor or anybody else that looks at your financial information and they'll say, well, I see in your general ledger you do this. Well, how are you allocating that cost? And you may be able to, with an auditor, say, well, here's our cost allocation sheet and how our calculations are. And they can maybe in that situation say, oh, I see that really what you're doing is an FTE method, or you're doing some other methodology. But why make it harder on the auditor? Because what we want to do with auditors, make it as plain and simple so that they can look at it and they say, okay, I can move on. I don't need to ask any more questions. When it's really kind of make it more complex like that, then there's room for auditors to come back and say, well, I'm asking questions because I want to know what you're doing. And, if you're doing some very complex way, it's usually that's where people start to get trouble. So you want to find a good way to do it, but also that's your method for defending how you're allocating your costs, and you should be in very good shape with your auditors.
And Mark, there's a question in the chat. If your CAP allocates costs to programs instead of the grant's revenue sources, is that confusing to monitors?
Well, most monitors now don't even look at percentages by revenue or by expenses, because it's not truly allocating costs to a better level. And so if you're using those 2 kind of things where you're using, well, we have X number of expenses all the way across for all of our programs, and now we're going to share that cost that we have so that it will allocate to the different grants. That is probably one that an auditor will kind of question, well, how do you know, in one sense? But if you're looking at it like, then that's why I like having the FTE, is that, well, how do you know? Well, you've done personnel evaluation. You've done figuring out where your people are and what percentage of time and all the activities go. And then those activities actually, how do you back up that activity in transactions to support that person and support the grant is really a lot more clear. And when you make it clear like that, usually you get the auditor on your side, and it's, you know, it's typically, and I think Roger will say this at the same time, that if it gets complex or it gets an area where auditors have to start questioning why you do that, then you kind of open the door for a finding in that situation. I know that in our grants, in our audits that we've had lately and everything else, we have put it very clearly, and an auditor can go right through it, and we have not had the experiences that we may have had way back in the past where, you know, they're looking at it and I don't understand how you got from here to there. And they start asking questions, and you find, you know, you get these small findings or a big finding in one sense. I look at us trying to protect everybody by, you know, defending what you do. You can do any kind of methodology. It's just, how did you defend it for either a funding agency that might be awarding you a grant, or if you've got a grant, how are you defending it for the auditors that come in? I hope that's helpful information.
So Mark, one
Okay.
follow-up question to that. Is it equally, I guess, is it equal to use revenue as a cost allocation method versus expenses, or both of them should probably shy away from?
They're both kind of more to shy away from.
Okay.
Because, you know, yeah, you can have X number of dollars that you've been awarded, but, you know, when you think about it, when you start going into cost, is that truly representing the cost for that program? Just because you were awarded this, one big thing is that a lot of times, as we all know in grants, whatever we ask for in a solicitation, we don't get 100% of that in most cases. So it already kind of skews that process to a certain degree. So how do you then address it when you're allocating cost? Good question.
I would just like to add, it should be based on the benefits received or the usage, and that way you're clear, like Mark mentioned, you know, but with the revenue and expenses, it just skews the whole equation.
So now we have it opened up for any additional questions if you have. At this time too, if you don't have any questions, I would recommend that if you have any ideas of topics that you would like to know about, and if you could also include that in the chat, so that way we can look at it, research it, and see what other topics we can use. What we've been doing is naturally looking at the topics that we think are most relevant for right now in the grant area, and how to protect everybody and make sure that people are in compliance. But there's a lot of areas that we haven't spoken to, and some of those might be smaller in that situation. But we like to give you as much service as we can by seeking topics that you would like for us to research and discuss at the same time.
And Mark, one thing I thought about, like, and this is just, this is Tim Love speaking, not necessarily like, you know, toss or that I've heard a funder say this or anything, but I know there was a question about, like, can you use different allocation methods for different costs, and absolutely, you know, that's true. And Also thinking about your statement about simplification, like thinking about an auditor asking questions, like
Mm,
I, I think there's a balance between those two, right? Like you want to use the
There
method
are.
that makes the most sense, that's easiest for you to defend, and that's easiest for you to actually put into practice.
Right.
And if there are ways that you can use the same allocation method that makes sense across multiple costs, then that makes, again, the application of it, right? Because that's the thing the auditor is going to look at is, do you have a policy and then did you consistently apply it? And so
Apply it.
that's one of
Yes.
the things that I would just, one of the things that we do at TASA is that we do just have like a couple of basically like two allocation methods that we use. And it just
Right.
makes it easier, especially the more grants you have to to justify and then to put those into application in a consistent way.
Yeah, as I would say that typically, uh, looking at the best methodology that can capture all your cost is the best direction. But then there may be certain specific costs that is the way you then modify and you use, like I said, square footage might be the reason why. That's probably one of the easier ones to have a modification of and be able to justify it and defend it in that situation. They may say, well, why didn't you just use FTE? And we said, well, we like to do a little bit more on square footage because it's a little bit different. And we might do a thing of square footage and FTEs to get a better allocation in that situation. So it may not, in that sense, you may be breaking away from the FTE itself, but you're now able to explain it because, oh, we're using square footage, but at the same time we're using, after we've developed the square footage and how things are doing, then we actually go to the next level and applying it to our FTEs. And auditors would say, well, you're actually giving us more detail. I understand your process and I don't have a problem with it. But if you're just changing because, well, I like something else on that, you need to, you should always think about how do I defend my methodology and my decision. It's really kind of how do I defend my business decision? Because an auditor can audit compliance and directions and whether they're right or wrong or your calculations are off, but they really shouldn't be auditing business decisions. That's just something that's kind of outside of the scope. And there's good information on that, on why. A good example a long time ago was FedEx. FedEx, the first time they came on board was way before the public was ready, and they went bankrupt and they closed. That same business decision, when they reopened and started, and now the public was ready for it, you can see how big they are. That was the same business decision in both cases and had two different outcomes. How does an auditor say, my business decision is better than your business decision? That gets very questionable. But as an auditor, I can say, well, your decision on how you allocate and everything else, I can track that and say, yeah, that fits within a criteria. So it's not a business decision. It's, are you compliant to a criteria? I hope that's helpful for everybody to kind of think about it, because a lot of times that's where you want to think about, how do I defend myself so that we can go through the process of, if we do have findings, can we allocate or negotiate? A lot of times, a lot of people don't realize that you get an audit from anywhere, there is some gray room and you can negotiate that.
Mark,
As long as you have a defendable methodology, let's put it that way.
sorry. There's actually a comment that says HHSC monitors have been asking for the FTE percentages used to create the square footage allocation.
Okay, so now it sounds like they want to do kind of allocate more, and that's the rationale. And when that kind of rationale is that, like we do, is we look at the whole square footage of the facility we have. And in certain cases, we might have an area like a training room. And then we might allocate that as a square footage and then say who uses that. And then we would use our FTE methodology for those specific employees that are really using that. And that's, I can easily defend that every day in that situation where somebody else, you may say, well, why does your auditor and your accountant and your CFO get allocated to a training? That's a little bit harder to, and maybe that's what HHSC is now kind of talking about, one sense. That's kind of one of the reasons we went way back and we looked at square footage to find out the price of square footage. Then we looked at the FTEs we had, and then we'd say for the FTEs in that area with that square footage, it comes out to a certain unit cost and per FTE. And then we then take our FTEs and multiply it to get to, okay, for that particular area, we have this cost that we can defend. It's a two-tiered level and kind of gets sophisticated. I have a spreadsheet that just goes way out with all of our people, and it's fun to watch in one sense if you're a geek like me.
And Mark, we have another question in the chat.
Okay.
Can you elaborate on shared cost allocation equitably? Do you have examples of share cost allocated equitably?
Well, examples would be utilities, all those kind of things that, the whole organization has, as you share that cost throughout the whole organization. FTE would do it a little bit more equitably because then you have that cost multiplied or calculated by the FTEs for that specific grant, and you would get that out in that direction. And a lot of our personnel are shared, multiple funded. So, we're not going to put 100% or a lot of our costs of utilities or other things like that on one grant when we can spread it out by FTE so that, that specific part, let's say on a person that's 50% on one grant, 50% on the other, and you have utilities, then only 50% of those kind of utilities for whatever that area is would best meet the needs in one sense. If you had 3 grants and on that, and they're 50, 25, 25, then that shared cost all the way through would go through that. And you use your FTE allocation really helps in that direction, because now you're talking about, when FTEs, you're talking about all of your organization's people in that sense. And some are not on grants, some are not, are on the grants. And so those FTE percentages will get you there. Good questions.
And I just want to remind folks that I put a link to a survey on this workshop in the chat. So if you could, before you leave, a link into that survey and give us your feedback on this workshop, we'd really appreciate it.
I have another question. What's the best method for allocating square footage of a building where the majority of the building is used as a shelter that houses clients, and the clients are being served by multiple grants and programs?
In that case, it depends on if you're using the facility cost of square footage and it's to, let's say, percentages of people that are working in there, FTE would be a good way to do that in that situation. And you've isolated the cost only to that part, the shelter, and then who's involved in that, could probably break it out better in one sense. Because if you have a shelter and there's multiple funding sources, then you have to figure out, well, which funding source gets how much of the rent or the square footage or other things like that. That would be kind of a little bit easier and better, because if you have X number of employees doing certain things, they're supporting everything to that facility. Hopefully that makes sense. If that didn't make sense for the person that asked the question, and just send me an email and I can always discuss it even more.
And Mark, we have one person said, yes, that does make sense. And they want to set up some time with you to discuss. So
Yes.
I'm going to put your email in the chat so folks can reach out to you.
Okay. On the last slide, I have my information in there, my email address and my phone number. So you can always contact me there. And that leads to a good kind of question in one sense, which I provide all the technical assistance. So my job is to provide that for all the organizations. I have, like everybody else, we have metrics to meet for our grants and everything. And don't hesitate to contact me. It's a win-win situation, because you get to ask the question, I get to answer it, and we can also include it in my metrics of the technical assistance that I'm providing. So you're not bothering me by asking questions. In fact, you're actually helping me out because I can provide that to the grant and show what I'm doing in that situation. So think about it that way. I've heard people before say, well, I don't want to bother Mark. Bother me, because it helps me at the same time. And it's a two-way win, for a win-win situation. So I've done that, when people ask for, by email, a specific topic. We've also done it where I've had a couple of financial people, let's say in one organization that is kind of new and wants more information. I've set up what we call check-ins, and it could be either monthly, quarterly, or whatever way you want to do it. And you can say, you can email them and say, Mark, I'd like to do a check-in meeting next month or so. And I say, if I'll find the time, and we negotiate when we could do that. And then you pick the topic that you want to have discussed in that check-in meetings. And that can mean a lot of different things. Compliance is one area, naturally, the grants, financial stuff like that. But I do a lot of different types of technical assistance. I think I said in the last time that I do other things like how do you do a succession planning. If you're planning to leave and you're trying to help set it up so that the next person comes in, or somebody that's in there. I've been involved in those, and I can help you in that sense. Board training I can do to a certain degree. We have several different areas for board training. Rose is probably the best for board training overall in the grants and just board because of our experience. We have Lawyer Ted, as we call him, that if you have that, we could check with Lawyer Ted, who's on contract with us and could do more of the HR legal kind of stuff. And then I've done a lot of training in boards from different areas that I've been in, where it's more about compliance and due care and other things like that I've done for, gosh, 30 years or so. So we have different kinds of ways that you might be even in an area of board training, we have different ways that we could do that. But that's another way that you can look at it instead of just, oh, it's just grants, it's just compliance, or really not just grants, but it's compliance or audit or other things. if there's an area that you want to talk about, if I don't know it, we'll get you somebody to do that. But most of the time I have that, or I research it to make sure I can give you the right citation at the same time. That was a good question in that sense.
And I would extend that to not just like, even if you're getting a grant through TASA, like I know sometimes people are hesitant to reach out to the folks who are funding them to ask questions about like the grant, but that's, we would much rather have those conversations on the front end to help people develop really strong systems and policies and practices, rather than waiting until we do the audits that we have to do of our subgrantees to find out that there's something wrong that could potentially cause a question cost or something like that. We'd much rather like help out on the front end, and you telling us that you're struggling with figuring out, how to do the allocation plan for a certain cost. That's not gonna cause problems. We'd much rather have those questions, like I said early on, before we get to a point where we're doing audits of folks.
Yeah. So we can be pretty broad in the type of technical assistance that we provide you, whether you have a grant with us or primarily more with funding grants. That a lot of times your agency that you're getting the award from doesn't have the people to in there that can do that, or a lot of them, they say their policy is not to do that. And I understand that specifically, let's say the Attorney General's office, they have all these attorneys there. I've worked with attorneys for almost 30, 40 years. They're very conservative, and they want to protect the agency from anything that could be potentially a risk. So they're more risk averse to provide assistance in that situation, because it's a position that they want to take to protect the Attorney General. Other agencies aren't that way, and they will provide a good technical assistance. But if you and if you're concerned about, like what Tim said, is that you go to an agency to ask the question and everything, and you're afraid that, oh, that's going to spur an audit. Well, we don't tell what we do in the sense of the type of technical assistance. We don't report to any of the funders in that direction. We just report we've provided these assistance. So if you feel more comfortable talking to us, please do.
So I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to let everyone know that I'm stopping the recording now, and then you're still welcome to ask any questions that you have. We have a few more minutes, or put them in the chat and we'll certainly get them to Mark.